Have you ever wondered why gas prices at your local station have been dancing so erratically over the past 3 years? Or why your family's grocery bills keep steadily climbing every month, even though you're buying less than before? Most of us Americans blame inflation, blame Fed policies, blame everything under the sun. But very few realize that the real answer might lie more than 8,000 miles away. It's in a war that many people think has nothing to do with them. Let's conduct a simple thought experiment together. On December 28, 2025, just a few days before you are watching this video, Trump and Zelensky sat for lunch at Mar-a-Lago, smiling broadly for the cameras. They announced that the Ukraine peace deal had reached 90 to 95% consensus on a 20-point framework. Trump called it maybe very close, while Zelensky demanded security guarantees lasting 30 to 50 years instead of just 15 years as initially proposed. Europe jumped on a video call in enthusiastic support. Everything seemed to be progressing well. Then, less than 24 hours later, Russia claimed Ukraine used 91 drones to attack Putin's Vald AI residence. Zelensky immediately called it a complete fabrication. French intelligence confirmed there was no evidence, and the Institute for the Study of War ISG reported zero footage. Vald AI locals heard no anti-aircraft fire whatsoever. But here is the truly important question I want you to consider. Regardless of whether this deal succeeds or fails, who is most directly affected? It's not the Ukrainians, it's not the Russians, it's you living and working on American soil. Because if this deal collapses, billions of dollars in aid will continue to flow out. Conversely, that money could return to fund tax cuts and domestic investment. Your gas prices, the food prices in your fridge, even your children's job opportunities, all are hanging in the balance of this negotiation. So, do you truly want to understand what is happening? Before diving deep into the analysis, I want to challenge an assumption that most of us take for granted. We often think peace negotiations are about peace, about a ceasefire, about saving lives. But what if I told you the meeting at Mar-a-Lago was actually a massive economic negotiation disguised as diplomacy? Look at what was actually being discussed at the table. The 20-point framework isn't just about borders or a ceasefire. It mentions establishing a free economic zone in the Donbass region, where American companies would be prioritized for investment in rare minerals like lithium and rare earths. These are essential materials for EV batteries and high-tech industries that China currently dominates. It discusses oil and gas extraction rights and reconstruction contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Zelensky needs $800 billion to rebuild Ukraine. Can you imagine how large that number is? It's nearly equal to the GDP of Switzerland, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. And when a country needs such a massive amount of money, they are forced to make significant concessions. Trump sees this and calls it huge wealth to be had for American businesses. From Lockheed Martin to RTX, from energy giants to infrastructure firms, everyone is lining up for a piece of this pie. But here is the crux I want you to think about. The issue of the Donbass and Zaporizhzhia territories remains the thorniest. Russia is not conceding a single inch of the land they have occupied. Zelensky, meanwhile, emphasizes that any decision to cede land must pass through a referendum, and 75% of Ukrainians currently reject the idea of giving up territory. So how can the two sides reach an agreement when the core issues remain deadlocked? And a small but significant detail: just before the meeting with Zelensky, Trump called Putin and described the call as good and very productive. Do you wonder what Putin said during that call? Could it have been a way of poisoning the well before official negotiations began? Because what happened immediately afterward makes everyone question the Kremlin's true goodwill. Now let's analyze the drone attack, event alleged by Russia. But instead of just looking at the military aspect, I want you to ask from a different perspective. Who benefits from sabotaging the negotiations? And into whose pocket does the economic price fall? Russia claimed Ukraine launched 91 long-range drones to attack Putin's Valdai residence on the night of December 28 to 29. Foreign Minister Lavrov called it state terrorism and demanded international condemnation. Sounds serious, right? But when you dig into the evidence, everything starts to crumble. The ISY confirmed no footage was released. French intelligence stated the allegations were not backed by any solid proof, and most bizarrely, local residents in Valdai, who should have heard the air defense systems if 91 drones were really incoming, reported that the night was completely silent. This isn't the first time the Kremlin has used this tactic. If you look back at history, before every major escalation, Russia often releases baseless allegations to create a pretext. Before the 2022 invasion, they also accused Ukraine of preparing to attack the Donbass. This pattern repeats so often that Western analysts call it a classic Kremlin false flag, but here is the part with a direct impact on you that I want you to truly understand. The Ukraine-Russia war is not just a conflict in distant Europe. Together, Ukraine and Russia account for nearly 30% of global wheat exports. As the war drags on, wheat supplies are disrupted, grain prices rise, and that cost is passed directly into the price of bread, pasta, animal feed, and ultimately, the meat on your table. At points in 2025, gas prices in some states rose by 10 to 20%, largely due to global oil price fluctuations contributed to by this war. And here is a number that shocks many Americans. Total US aid to Ukraine since 2022 has exceeded $175 billion. To put that in perspective, that money is enough to build over 1 million affordable homes or fully fund college for over 10 million American students. Most of this aid returns to the American defense industry in the form of weapons production contracts, but it remains a massive expenditure from the federal budget. A budget ultimately funded by your tax dollars. So, if this fake drone tactic successfully sabotages the negotiations, what happens next? Will the US continue to pump tens of billions more into the war, or will there be another turning point? And more importantly, is the failure of a peace deal actually a bad thing for Americans, or is there a counterintuitive perspective that the mainstream media is missing? Now I want to pose a question that might make you uncomfortable. If the peace deal succeeds, who is truly the biggest winner? Most of us would immediately answer that it's Ukraine, the innocent people suffering under daily bombardment. But if you look at the details of the 20-point framework being negotiated, the answer might be much more complex than you think. Let's analyze what has leaked from the negotiations. According to the framework, Russia would keep about 19% of Ukrainian territory it has occupied, essentially freezing the current front lines. In exchange, the US would be prioritized in Ukraine's reconstruction contracts, a market worth $800 billion, as I mentioned. But even more important than reconstruction money is access to resources. Ukraine possesses the largest lithium reserves in Europe, along with significant deposits of rare earths, titanium, and uranium. These are not ordinary minerals. These are strategic materials for the EV revolution and semiconductor technology. Currently, China controls over 60% of global rare earth production and nearly 80% of refining capacity. Every Tesla, every iPhone, every US military-guided missile depends on a supply source that Beijing could cut off at any time. Do you see why Ukraine has suddenly become so vital? If the deal succeeds and US companies lead the extraction of Ukrainian minerals, it means thousands of new jobs will be created in Pennsylvania, Texas, and Arizona, states that produce batteries and high technology. Corporations like Lockheed Martin, RTX, and General Dynamics wouldn't just gain weapons contracts. They could also expand into infrastructure reconstruction. That's why Trump sees huge wealth to be had, and why he is pushing the negotiations so hard. But here is the twist I want you to think through. Zelensky fiercely opposes ceding the Donbass without a referendum. He knows that 75% of Ukrainians would reject any deal requiring the abandonment of territory. This puts him in a bind between pressure from Washington to end the war quickly and the will of the people he represents. Meanwhile, Russia rejects all ceasefire proposals, continuing to attack even while negotiations are underway. So is this deal actually feasible, or is it just a diplomatic mirage? Trump claims we're closer than ever, but the thorniest issues remain unresolved. And while leaders shake hands for photos, Europe is facing the reality that they might have to shoulder more if the US decides to pivot to other priorities. Starmer of the UK, Macron of France, all are being pushed into a position where they must increase defense spending, a burden they could previously shift onto American shoulders. So the question is, if the deal fails, is that really a bad thing for America? This is perhaps the most controversial part of this entire analysis, but I want you to temporarily set aside what the mainstream media is saying and look at the actual numbers. The common assumption is that a successful peace deal is good for everyone, and failure would be a disaster. But what if that assumption is wrong? Let's start with what's happening on the battlefield. 2025 has seen the slowest Russian advance since the war began in 2022. Meanwhile, Russian casualties have skyrocketed, with estimates of hundreds of thousands of cumulative troop losses. Russia's economy is under heavy pressure from sanctions, oil revenues are declining, and the cost of war is increasingly weighing on the budget. In other words, Russia is slowly bleeding out in a war of attrition they cannot win quickly. Now look at it from the perspective of the US economy. $175 billion in aid sounds massive, but here is what many people don't realize. Most of that money never actually leaves the United States. It returns in the form of contracts for weapons factories in 38 states, creating jobs for tens of thousands of American workers in Arizona, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Every Javelin missile sent to Ukraine is produced by American workers, with components from American suppliers. So, Ukraine aid is actually a form of disguised domestic economic stimulus. But here is the counterintuitive viewpoint I want you to consider. If the peace deal fails and the US decides to reduce or stop aid, what happens? First, billions of dollars will no longer be tied to a conflict on the other side of the globe. That money could be redirected toward tax cuts for citizens, domestic infrastructure investment, or reducing the budget deficit. Second, Europe will be forced to shoulder their own defense costs, instead of leaning on the US security umbrella as they have for 70 years. Third, the US will have a freer hand to focus on the threat many experts believe is far more important: China in the Indo-Pacific. Trump, after hearing news of the drone attack, was reportedly furious and considered pausing aid. Many see this as a negative reaction, but what if you look at it from an America First perspective? If Russia exposes itself as the party sabotaging negotiations with baseless allegations, it allows the US to diplomatically withdraw with justification, blame Moscow, and save taxpayer money. Is this the 4D chess game Trump is playing, or am I just overanalyzing? The real question you need to answer for yourself is, how much more are you willing to pay for a war in Europe? Higher gas prices, higher food prices, tax dollars flowing into aid instead of public services. Are all these hidden costs worth maintaining a world order that many argue no longer serves US interests as it once did? Join me in sketching out 2 scenarios for 2026 and see how each scenario affects your life. This isn't a prediction, but a thought exercise for you to assess your own risks and opportunities. Scenario 1. The peace deal succeeds. The war ends, or at least freezes. American companies flood into Ukraine to secure reconstruction and mining contracts, but global energy and food prices stabilize, and you start to see grocery bills hurting your wallet less. In return, The US commits to security guarantees for Ukraine for 15 to 30 years, meaning a long-term defense expenditure that your children's generation will have to bear. Defense industry jobs might decrease as there is no longer an urgent need for weapons production, but jobs in construction and mining could increase. This is the scenario mainstream media describes as win-win, but do you see the hidden costs within it? Scenario 2. The deal collapses, and the war continues as a prolonged conflict of attrition. Russia continues its slow advance while suffering heavy losses. Ukraine continues to resist with drones attacking deep into Russian territory, targeting refineries and military infrastructure. The US might choose to reduce aid, forcing Europe to shoulder most of the costs. In this scenario, energy prices might fluctuate in the short term, but the US, as the world's largest oil producer, has much higher resilience than import-dependent Europe. US gas prices might rise slightly, but won't be catastrophic as many fear. Meanwhile, billions of dollars saved from cutting aid could be used for domestic priorities. But here is the factor most analyses overlook. Regardless of which scenario happens, the mineral deals that the US and Ukraine signed privately remain in effect. The joint investment fund established by both sides remains operational. In other words, American businesses can still benefit from Ukrainian resources regardless of whether the war ends or continues. That's why some analysts argue that Washington isn't actually in a rush to end the conflict, because the longer it lasts, the weaker Russia becomes, and the stronger the US negotiating position grows. So what will 2026 look like for your wallet? If you work in the defense industry in one of the 38 states with weapons plants, your job might be secure regardless of the scenario, because either aid continues or the US needs to replenish depleted stockpiles. If you were an average consumer worried about gas and food prices, the good news is that the US has enough domestic production capacity to avoid being as severely affected as Europe. And if you are a taxpayer concerned about how your money is used, this is perhaps the time to ask serious questions about the administration's true priorities. One detail from the December negotiations that few noticed: Trump suggested that Ukraine should accept a deal early before Russia seizes more territory. But at the same time, he didn't set any real deadline or pressure. Was that indecisiveness or a calculated strategy to prolong the game until the US is in the best position? I want to conclude the main analysis with a question you probably haven't heard anyone ask on mainstream news. Why does the American media always frame the failure of a peace deal as a disaster when there are perspectives that show the exact opposite? Look at what is actually happening that few people talk about. If the Mar-a-Lago deal collapses, the most direct consequence isn't that the US will have to spend more money, but that Europe will be forced to stand on its own 2 feet. For 70 years since World War II, NATO allies in Europe have benefited from the US security umbrella without paying their fair share of the costs. Germany, Europe's largest economy, spent only about 1.4% of its GDP on defense, far below the 2% NATO commitment. France and the UK are slightly better but still rely significantly on US military capabilities. When Trump pushes the America First policy and threatens to reduce the commitment to Ukraine, he's essentially sending a clear message to Brussels and Berlin: the era of free riding is over. And you know what? It's working. Starmer of the UK has announced plans to increase defence spending. Macron of France is pushing for a more independent European defence force. Germany, however reluctantly, is rearming at a pace unseen since the Cold War. So we've been through a long journey, from lunch at Mar-a-Lago to evidence-free drone allegations, from the 20-point framework to the direct economic impacts on your life. And if you noticed, I intentionally didn't provide a final conclusion for you, because that's not my job. If this video made you think, whether you agree or disagree with me, hit like so more people have the chance to access different perspectives. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to continue the journey of asking questions with me. and share this video with people you care about regarding the economic future of America. See you again. Keep asking questions. And remember, in a world full of information noise, the ability to think independently is your most valuable asset.